60 years ago, NASA flew possibly their most audacious missions ever. Project Gemini flew 10 flights in a compressed 20-month period that saw them prove out all the things they would need to be able to make it to the moon. And this week on the Aviation Show, brought to you as always by the fabulous Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona, we have 2 episodes that are focusing on Project Gemini because Jeffrey Kluger, the co-author of Apollo 13, yes, the guy who brought us this,
Houston, we have a problem,
is back with his new book, Gemini, Stepping Stone to the Moon, The Untold Story. And Jeffrey delves into the story of the Gemini missions and the men who flew them, because you can't get to the moon without Gemini. Because by the end of Mercury, there was a lot of thought to meet President Kennedy's deadline that they should just go straight to Apollo. Gemini was the outcome of that discussion, and it was fantastic to talk to Jeffrey and discover a little bit more about the project that seems to have fallen through the cracks in NASA history. So, without further ado, over to Jeffrey. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. As we were saying just before we started recording, thoroughly enjoyed the book, and it's going to be great to chat to you about this project. But we need to start with the elephant in the room, which is, how do we pronounce it? Because I've always called it Gemini, but that's
Right.
probably high school English lessons here in England beating things into me.
Right.
NASA say it slightly differently, don't they?
Yes, NASA back in the day, the pronunciation was Gemini with a long E. And the provenance of that name, as far as I've been able to tell, is that back in the mid-60s, astrology was not what it is today. You know, it was sort of sequestered in a much smaller cohort of the population. So it's entirely possible that people within NASA just hadn't really acquainted themselves with the word Gemini and just mispronounced it. Well, that mispronunciation stuck. They began talking to the press that way. They began citing missions as Gemini 3, Gemini 4, and it became something of a shibboleth. You know, it was a mark of your belonging if you pronounced it as Gemini. The newscasters picked it up, Walter Cronkite and Jules Bergman, you know, the 2 real giants of the space program picked it up. And ultimately, NASA issued a release establishing the formal pronunciation, and they said the formal pronunciation would be with the long E at the end, Gemini. I found this in a New York Times story from 1965, and they attributed it to their, I forget what the full name was, but the official names and titles or official nomenclature committee, which to my knowledge did not exist. I think they just invented this whole cloth to explain or justify how they named it. So within NASA, it's Gemini. Outside of NASA, it's Gemini.
My OCD will be tingling if I try to say Gemini too much. And even reading the book, every time it came up, it was just like, no, Gemini, that's
Gemini.
Yeah, I can hear my English teacher now. But Project Gemini, I've been fascinated with it since I was little, because it sort of falls in this interesting place between the Right Stuff Mercury guys and all the Apollo moon landings.
Right.
But like the sort of tag of your book, this doesn't get the focus that those two projects do. And I'm sort of moving this question forward a bit, because why doesn't it? Because it is amazing. Why is it sort of fallen between it? Is it because of, say, Tom Wolfe and then landing on the moon? Is that basically it?
That is a big part of it. You know, I have often said Tom Wolfe wrote the definitive story on the Mercury program. It is a testament to that book that 45 years after it came out, no one has done another Mercury book. Other people have written about the Mercury program. I've certainly written about it. I wrote about it in Gemini. I wrote about it in my Apollo 8 book. I wrote about it in Apollo 13. But nobody is going to touch that. Maybe in 100 years, somebody else will write a book about the Mercury program. But Tom Wolfe staked that ground out in 1979, and he has held it since, even in death. Many people have written about the Apollo program. I certainly did. Andy Chaikin, a friend of mine, wrote what I consider the definitive book on the Apollo program, called straightforwardly A Man on the Moon. The astronauts and the flight directors have written their own autobiographies that cover the moon landings, but Gemini didn't get that kind of attention. And I think there are a couple of reasons. Mercury was when we first sent people into space. So, that had that headline making punch. And there was a suborbital first, and then there was an orbital. And then there was, toward the end, at the end of that program, there was a 33-hour flight, which was unheard of. A man had spent more than a day in space. Nobody even knew if that could be done. With the Apollo program, we were going to another world. These were the first steps truly off the planet and outside of the Earth's gravity sphere. And that made its own kind of sensational headlines. Gemini was the middle child in this troika of siblings. It didn't have that first out of the blocks feel to it. It didn't have that going to another world feel to it. And it also, I think, was to an extent a victim of its own success, because we flew so many of them in so short a time period. 10 of them went up over the course of a 20-month period. So once every 8 to 10 weeks, we were launching more men into space. And I think people lost track of it. It's the reason the shuttles didn't get all the attention that they deserved. The shuttles were, they were a deadly machine in 2 cases, but they were a magnificent machine in the other cases. But we flew them 135 times. Who's going to keep track of them? Similarly with the space station, men and women have been aboard the space station continually. It has been continually inhabited for 25 years. So people sort of forget about it. And I think Gemini suffered a bit from that sort of over familiarity, which caused people to stop paying attention as the missions were flying.
So damned by its own success.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go back to the beginning. And President Kennedy famously challenges NASA to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth by the end of the decade.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
He interestingly had said internally that he wanted 1967 to be the date.
Right.
It was bad enough, I guess, in NASA hearing by the end of the decade. Why was 1967 a particular date in his mind?
1967 marked the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And, it was clear early in the 60s that the Soviets had, big events and all manner of sensational nationwide celebrations planned for that 50th anniversary, that half century of communism. And Kennedy wanted to spit in the Soviet soup. He wanted to mess up their celebration. It was clear that the 2 countries were in a foot race for space. They were in a foot race to the moon. And, if there was an American flag planted on the moon in the same year that the Soviets were, wholly as a nation saluting the Soviet flag, it simply would have taken the shine off the celebration. So that was the goal for that propaganda win and that, that sort of symbolic win.
And NASA's reaction to this was, I don't want to say incredulous. It was just pure shock, wasn't it?
It was shock. NASA was gobsmacked. When Kennedy first made that announcement on May 25th, 1961, the U.S. had a total of 17 minutes in space. The only flight we had flown was Al Shepard's Pop Gun suborbital, and he got to about 120 miles up. So at the top of his parabola, for 3 to 5 minutes at the top of his parabola, he was truly in space. The rest was, a cannonball shot up through the atmosphere and down through the atmosphere. And NASA was supposed to go from 15 minutes and 120 miles up to 2 weeks and 250,000 miles away, and it hadn't even yet orbited a man. So yeah, NASA was absolutely flabbergasted at the audaciousness of the challenge.
The Mercury flights, as you said, Tom Wolfe has covered. If I'm honest, I really like the beginning bit with the breaking of the sound barrier a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think that writing is fantastic. But then, if you don't fall in love with Gordo Cooper by the end of the right stuff, you've been reading the book wrong.
Exactly.
And that's really the culmination of Mercury is Gordo's 33-hour flight with
Right.
that. But the Mercury capsule, if we're to describe it, how did you put it? You sort of said if the Gemini spacecraft was a Cadillac, Mercury was what? It was a cannonball,
Mercury was
essentially.
a Volkswagen.
Yeah.
It was a VW Beetle. It was small. It was simple. There wasn't a lot you could do with it. As a result, there also wasn't a lot that could break down on it. The Gemini 8 spin out that almost cost Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott their lives was a direct result of the function in the very elaborate thruster system Gemini had, at least compared to Mercury. Mercury had, I think 6 little 25-pound thrusters that allowed you to sort of wag the ship this way and that. Gemini had, now I'm forgetting the number, either 28 or 32 thrusters arrayed around the ship at, 25 pounds or 100 pounds of thrust, depending upon what job was being done. It was just an infinitely more complex ship. It's funny, I was in John Glenn's office, his Senate office, interviewing him back in 1998 when he was about to return to space as a 78-year-old man aboard one of the shuttles. I think it was Discovery. And I was sitting on a couch in his office, and next to me was a little model of a Mercury capsule. And I was looking at it, marveling at the detail. And then I saw a legend on it that said scale 1 to 9. So I was looking at a toy that was only 1/9 of the size of the entire Mercury capsule. If it had grown 9 times its size, I would have been taller than it. It was just incredible to me that these men were able to fly in this machine. The line that they used to say was, "You don't climb inside the Mercury, you put it on." And that's what it was. It was just, a giant thimble-shaped garment that the astronauts were wearing.
Did NASA think they could make the jump from a Mercury-style vehicle to a lunar one? Was there sort of conflict within the organization to sort of go straight for the moon? And did Gemini sort of come up as a compromise? Was there much thought that they needed something in the middle?
That's a really good question. There was talk of just concluding the Mercury program with Gordo Cooper's flight after Deke Slayton was grounded due to fibrillation. It was only going to be 6 flights rather than 7. But there was talk of completing those missions, letting the launch pads go cold for 2 or 3 years while they built the first Apollos, and then going straight to Apollo. But the problem was they didn't have fundamental skills. We didn't know how to rendezvous in space. The physics of that are really screwy, and it's a really hard thing to do. We didn't know how to dock with another spacecraft, which was critical because the lunar module and the command module had to dock and undock in lunar orbit in order to get the astronauts down to the surface of the moon and get them home. We didn't know how to walk in space, which was a critical skill. Not quite as critical a skill for Apollo, though the astronauts did have to practice getting out of the spacecraft. But walking in space has been an essential part of the construction and maintenance of the space station and the repair of the Hubble Space Telescope for the last quarter of a century. And they didn't know anything about long duration space flights. Gordo Cooper's flight of 33 hours seemed like a long time, but a lunar mission takes, up to 2 weeks. That's what Apollo 17 took, which is why Jim Lovell and Frank Borman spent 14 days inside the Gemini 7 spacecraft without a spacewalk, just locked inside there for a fortnight. There was talk of a compromise of building a somewhat bigger, somewhat more robust, and definitely more capable Mercury spacecraft that the designers were calling the Mercury Mark II. So there was a possibility that we would go Mercury Mark II, another one-man spacecraft, but they could practice docking with it, and then Apollo. And ultimately, they realized they really needed a full, functional, complex spacecraft, infinitely more so than Mercury, in order to practice these skills. And, that's when they finally decided on the larger two-man Gemini spacecraft, which flew for 20 months in 1965 and 66.
Let's talk about that spacecraft, because if you were just to see sort of two pictures next to each other, they're very similar-ish in shape.
Right.
It's still that sort of bell shape. Gemini clearly is a bit bigger, but what went into making Gemini such a more advanced spacecraft than Mercury?
Well, the thrusters, which, as we discussed, that was a really big part of it, a part of the maneuverability and the navigatability of the spacecraft that Mercury did not have. The onboard computer was more robust. The life support system was much bigger, much richer, much more complicated, as it had to be to support two men over a period of up to a couple of weeks. It also was a breakthrough in spacecraft design, because the Mercury spacecraft was so tiny that all of the mechanics, all of the electronics, all of the hydraulics, all of the life support systems had to be sort of stuffed behind the instrument panel and packed into the walls of the spacecraft itself. Only one man at a time could work on the Mercury spacecraft because it was so tiny, and it required, a man to crawl inside, pull out the instrument panel, and then do repair and maintenance work. The Gemini spacecraft had an adapter section at the end, a sort of an unoccupied bottom part of the spacecraft where the retro rockets to get them back to Earth were, and also where a lot of the components, oxygen tanks and hydrogen tanks and helium tanks and fuel tanks, all of those could be stowed in the adapter section in a way that was similar to putting a lot of your equipment in the trunk of your car. And that made it easier to build. It made it easier to repair, and it allowed for more complicated systems to be built into the spacecraft. So it really was, it looked like the Mercury, but it was a whole different species of ship.
When I was up at Udvar-Hazy back in February, getting shown around Discovery by Jennifer Levasseur, who's wonderful, she did point out the Gemini parasail, and I had completely ignored that part of the story,
Right.
because it's frankly wild.
Yeah.
Because whereas, we're sort of so used to seeing these things descend under parachutes and then splash down. What was the idea with the parasail?
The idea of the parasail was, rather than having a single parachute open up, unreef, and lower the spacecraft to the ocean with the bell of the heat shield at the bottom, so the ship was straight up and down, the thinking was to do away with that and instead have a parasail, very much like a paraglider that people use recreationally, both on water skis and cliff diving, that would open up and lower the spacecraft with the astronauts in a seated position. It would unfurl from, within, after being packed away in the skin of the spacecraft. The parasail would unfurl, and a pair of skids would open up on the bottom, would be deployed on the bottom, and the ship would land very much like a skier, coming down from a high jump. Again, the astronauts would be in a seated position, the ship would be nose forward, and the skids would come out of the bottom. There were a couple of arguments in favor of the parasail. One was that it allowed for more pinpoint landings. Astronauts could, much more easily navigate and target where they were going to land, which made recovery easier. And also, there was a real, concern at the time that if a spacecraft landed in open ocean and the Soviets happened to be prowling those waters or happened to be following where it was going to come down, a spacecraft could be seized and an astronaut could be abducted, and the U.S. saw it as a security concern. Now, realistically, the Soviets weren't going to do that, but they didn't face the same danger that, even if it was imaginary danger, they didn't face the same danger that America did, because they did land their spacecraft on solid ground within the borders of the Soviet Empire, whereas we landed it in the no man's land of, typically in the Atlantic Ocean, except for Gemini 8, which splashed down in the Pacific. So that was that was a concern, and that was one of the motivations for considering the parasail. Ultimately, they did away with it because a parachute is so safe and so simple and so reliable. And safe, simple, and reliable are three of the sweetest words an engineer can hear, as opposed to a very complex system like the parasail. So midway through development, they finally did away with the parasails and decided, a reliable parachute was the way to go.
You can almost think that Chris Kraft almost had that written on his forehead, the safe,
simple, and reliable. Yeah. Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned before 10 flights inside of 20 months, a remarkable rate of flying. NASA at the end of Mercury don't even have their original 7 anymore, do they? Because
that's correct. Yeah.
Al Shepard and John Glenn are grounded due to PR and political reasons.
Right.
Deke's not well with his heart. Right. That leaves 3 because one of them had been a naughty boy, hadn't he?
Right. Scott Carpenter was grounded because he flew his one Mercury mission very badly and very sloppily and disobeyed a lot of orders to conserve fuel and was spending too much time sightseeing and playing around, that he re-entered badly and landed 250 miles off course, whereas the other astronauts were landing 3 to 4 miles from their original position. So Chris Kraft said he will never fly again. And I asked him before I knew about his feelings toward Carpenter, when I was writing Apollo 13. I asked him, I asked him who the best astronaut he ever flew was and who the worst one was, or if he ever made a mistake. And he said, yes, Scott Carpenter. That was, my biggest mistake. And I said, well, how do you mean? Why? And his words were, he was a dumbass. And I said, okay, when you say dumbass, what do you mean? And he looked at me incredulously and said, I mean stupid, not smart. That's what I mean. So he grounded Carpenter. NASA didn't release that information publicly, but it was clear that Carpenter was going to get his one flight and he would never fly again.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777 and the second prototype 787 Dreamliner. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its 3rd year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better because the Philippine Mars is now on display, and right across the car park, the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum's doors are wide open to welcome you in to check out an amazing collection of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and other vehicles, if you get fed up with all the airplanes. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing. The next two batches of astronauts contain arguably some of the most famous astronauts to have ever flown. I guess, do you want to run through some of those names? Because
sure, yeah. I mean,
one of them, of course, we've already mentioned, and you knew very well in Jim Lovell. But you've got an amazing list, haven't you?
Yeah, it was. I mean, this was where a lot of the Mount Rushmore names came from. You know, this is where you got Jim Lovell, and this is where you got Frank Borman, and this is where you got Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Pete Conrad and John Young. John Young is amazing. He flew two Gemini flights, two Apollo flights, went to the moon twice, and two shuttle flights. And he was, you know, an active astronaut into his 70s and perhaps even 80s. You know, I remember seeing a poster at the Kennedy Space Center or the Johnson Space Center, I forget which one, and it was all of the active astronauts arranged in a grid. And Young came last because alphabetically Young put him at the bottom. So you saw all of these, you know, 35 and 45-year-old faces, and then the very last face was 75 years old and still in a flight suit and still considered an active astronaut. So, you know, this is where, you know, John Young came from this program too. Tom Stafford was one of the greats, flew on Gemini 6, Gemini 9, Apollo 10, and the Apollo-Soyuz joint U.S.-Soviet space flight. And Gene Cernan, the last man on the moon, was part of that class of astronauts. So you got huge names, you got legends of aerospace, and you know, they all learned their skills in the Gemini spacecraft.
I don't really know how to phrase this, but the one that always sticks in my head, and it's because of one photo, and that's Ed White. Because of that photo of him just after his spacewalk back inside Gemini 4, where he looks exhausted, exhilarated, and the happiest man alive, with just a little bit of lens flare coming through the thing. And, you know, tragically died during the Apollo 1 fire.
Right.
But for me, as a fan of spaceflight, just that look on his face says to me that's what it means to have just walked in space.
That's exactly right. When he was told to come inside the capsule, he at first playfully refused. And then Jim McDivitt and Chris Kraft both, you know, ordered him more sternly to come back inside. And he said, famously, "This is the saddest moment of my life." He had a grand time doing that. And that's something that I've often thought about. There's a photograph that was taken in the early 80s, and people often label it as the most terrifying space photo ever captured. And it's Bruce McCandless, a shuttle astronaut, who was the first and so far only person ever to maneuver himself through space without a tether. He had this giant backpack, a man maneuvering unit, it was called, and he flew out 200 or 300 yards from the shuttle, and was just hanging in space. And the picture that was taken of him was this vast sweep of the earth below and blackness around, and this little human, this little living figure in the middle of the screen, in the middle of the shot. I don't think any of us fully appreciate how primally terrifying that would be if you are not trained to within an inch of your life not to be afraid of it, to be able to take joy from that, looking down and realizing there's nothing holding you up, being in a situation in which all of the physics of what you're accustomed to have been stripped away. The fact that someone like Bruce McCandless and someone like Ed White could have a grand time doing that instead of panicking and saying, "Get me back inside," you know, I think was a testament to the steel from which these men were made.
Yeah, I think when you put the picture of Ed in his silver spacesuit with the pop gun and the tether, and you put Bruce next to it, yeah, I as much as I'd love to go to space, I don't particularly fancy doing
I don't think
either
I
of
would
those
either.
things.
Yeah.
Let's talk about rendezvous, because you've got a fantastic bit in the book about Buzz Aldrin just working the math constantly,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and helping all of that work out. But the first, not docking, but rendezvous in space with Gemini 6A and 7 comes about because a lot of other things have gone wrong, and it's NASA running on the fly and making this thing work when all else isn't exactly going as per schedule.
Right. Yeah, this was Gemini 6 was supposed to go up in October of 1965. And they were supposed to rendezvous and dock with an Agena spacecraft. And Agena was basically, it was an uncrewed spacecraft that was basically a 23-foot long metal tube. And at one end was an engine, and at the other end was a docking collar, a port into which the Gemini spacecraft could insert its nose, the aft end of the ship, and then the two ships would be locked together in what was called a hard dock. And it was practice for doing a rendezvous and docking in lunar orbit. The Agena was supposed to go up. It did leave the ground, and about 3 minutes into its flight, it exploded. So the Agena never made it to space. And Gemini 6 effectively had nowhere to go because the whole point of the mission was to go up and dock with something. NASA decided on the fly that it would, instead of worrying about docking with an Agena, which had to be, they only had one on the shelf and it was going to take a couple of months to build a new one, instead of waiting for a new Agena to be built, and instead of allowing Gemini 6 to dock with that, they would send up Gemini 7 on its scheduled 2-week flight in December of 1965. And on the 6th or 7th day of that mission, while it was in orbit, launch Gemini 6 on a 3-day mission or a 2-day mission and allow the two ships to rendezvous in orbit. They wouldn't be able to dock with each other. Neither ship had a docking collar, but they could come within inches of each other and prove that rendezvous could be done. It was a completely improvised plan. It involved, maintaining the pad. Launch pads typically, take a lot of damage when a rocket goes up, and then they get scrubbed down and painted, and equipment gets replaced, and the blasted concrete, the blackened concrete at the bottom is cleaned, and the pad is made pretty and presentable for its next launch. And that was part of the PR, because very important people, politicians and industry people, would be taken out for tours of the launch pad, and you wouldn't want a pad that looked burned and damaged. In the case of the launch between Gemini 6 and Gemini 7, they said, we'll fly off a dirty pad. We don't have the time for the luxury of aesthetics and prettifying the launch pad. So Gemini 7 went up. Gemini 6 was supposed to go up. It ultimately turned out to be about the 9th day of the mission. But they had a launch problem. The engines didn't light. There was a blockage in a fuel pump. So they only had 3 or 4 days left while Gemini 7 was still in orbit. And on the 11th day of the Gemini 7 flight, Gemini 6 did launch, did rendezvous with the ship, and some of the most dramatic pictures of the space age came out of that mission, with the two ships nose to nose in low Earth orbit. It was a magnificent paired mission.
And it gave Frank and Jim something to do.
Well, exactly. That's right. And there was some talk of bringing them down after that, coming down early. And, both men decided, look, we've done 11 days. We can do 14 at this point. But they did not pretend to have enjoyed that mission.
No, I'm slightly claustrophobic, so just the thought of that would be terrifying.
Yeah, I don't know how I would do it.
Buzz Aldrin, we mentioned him a second ago. I didn't put this in my list of questions for you, but I think it's worth throwing in. He's known as the second man on the moon, and now
Right.
his Get to Mars stick that you see him doing quite a bit. But his role on Gemini is vital, isn't it? Because
it was, yeah.
He also sets a record that has never been beaten for a spacewalk, as far as I'm aware. has it? The 5.5 hours?
Well, people have done
Yeah.
longer spacewalks, but not at the time. And he did
Mm,
3 spacewalks.
mm,
2 were stand-up EVAs, opening the hatch, standing up in the seat. But one of them was floating over to the Agena, retrieving an experiment, working on what they called a busy box, which was, testing tools and clippers and wrenches and, all manner of tools that he could use in space that couldn't be used like a tool on the Earth, because if you turn a wrench one way in space, your body just moves the other way. So they had to invent tools that worked with squeezes instead of turns, so that you weren't torquing your body in one direction or another. Yes, but he was the champion of spacewalking after Gemini 12. And he was a genius. He is a genius. He was brilliant. He graduated. He went to grad school at MIT. He got his PhD at MIT. He is Dr. Buzz Aldrin. Too few people address him as Dr. Aldrin, but we all should. And his thesis was on rendezvous and docking in low Earth orbit. And that came in handy because on Gemini 12, during the 2 or 3 rendezvous and dockings they had with an Agena, the onboard computer failed. And they just relied on the computer inside Buzz's head, and they rendezvoused and docked fine with his help. So yeah, Buzz, I was reading something online recently, and somebody was lamenting the fact that we call Neil the first man on the moon, and Buzz the second man on the moon. He was making the point they landed together, they touched down together. Who went down the ladder first was an irrelevant piece of historical trivia. They were only like 19 minutes apart. Somebody was arguing 60 years on that they should both just be referred to as the first 2 men on the moon. And I would be inclined to agree with that. I will say this, that Buzz was more poetic than Neil. I remember I was only 15 years old and I was already judgmental. So when Armstrong descended the ladder and he said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," I remember not liking those first words because they seemed too scripted, and they clearly were scripted. Neil insists he wrote them himself. I believe it, but he still scripted them himself. Buzz uttered what I consider the most exquisite oxymoron ever contrived when he called the surface of the moon magnificent desolation. And, that is to me so lyrical. It's 2 words, magnificent desolation, 8 syllables, and it just captured everything about what he was seeing.
mm. It's a perfect line. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's I 100% agree with that. And I did call him second man on the moon, but I think that's just for shorthand. A while ago, I interviewed a music video director called Sam Pilley, who made this fantastic video for DJ Shadow and De La Soul, where it's Kubrick faking the moon landing, and
Yeah.
their Neil and Buzz's get into a fight in the capsule, and it all goes wrong because they're both trying to get out first, and it's a fabulous thing. And I remember Sam saying to me, in all his research, because he had the idea and he was reading all the books and trying to get into it, at no point could he find something he could hang his hat on to say,
Right.
there was this moment that I can link to it. He says this.
Right.
He said, I've just had to say this is complete fantasy, because there was never in any of it a moment of sort of argument over who
Right.
was going to be first down the ladder, which he said was actually quite freeing, because it meant he could just do what he wanted for the
Whatever
video.
he wanted. Yeah. And that was true between Neil and Buzz, and it was certainly true in terms of what the public heard. But Buzz was campaigning actively in the run-up to Apollo 11 to be the first man down the ladder. And one of his arguments was, look, in all of the EVAs, all the spacewalks, it was the second in command who took the walk. It was the commander who stayed inside. And he said, we should just stick with that practice. He went far enough to go to Washington, either to Capitol Hill or the Pentagon, and campaign for to be the first man with lawmakers and with the military. And finally, NASA put their foot down. And the story, and I tried to ask Jim Lovell about this, and he was a little bit equivocal, and I didn't want to press him. But the story that went around is they threatened Buzz with being removed from the mission, and Jim would take his place. And Jim would have happily been the second man on the moon. And Buzz sort of, straightened up after that and stopped making a big deal over it.
We're getting on to Apollo now. We'll have to come back to that another time. But
Okay.
yeah, I find both Neil and Buzz the most fascinating characters because they're character-wise they're so different and yet so complementary. That landing, the way they work together to ensure that they got down.
Yeah.
Arguably one of the greatest bits of flying in history.
Roger, 1202, we copy it. 35 degrees, 750, coming down to 23. 540 feet down at 15. 10 and 50 feet down at 4. Altitude, velocity, light. 3.5 down, 220 feet. 5 and forward, coming down nicely, 200 feet. 4.5 down, 5.5 down. 100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on, forward. Forward. 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward, just. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Yeah, and they had to fly over a boulder field, and they were down to 1% or 2% of their fuel. I asked, it was either Chris Kraft or Gene Kranz. I think it was Gene Kranz. I asked him if they had gotten to zero, would it be like a car's gas tank on empty when you've still got a little bit of what they would call in flight blowdown fuel? You've got fuel in the system, in the tubing, so you can go a little bit further than, when the gas tank reads empty and you're still driving and trying to make it to a gas station. And Cran said, no, it was not that way at all. If they had hit zero, it would have been a hard stop on the engine. The engine just would have gone cold. So, they landed with a couple percent and about, 60 seconds of fuel left and had to navigate over boulders the size of a car. And they did it. They stuck the landing right where they wanted to.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And they would not have gotten there without Gemini. And
they would not have gotten there without Gemini. Yeah.
I hope you don't mind me asking this last question because we lost Jim Lovell earlier this year, and you knew him very well from your time together writing Lost Moon, Apollo 13, and all the subsequent bits. Do you have any memories of him that you'd like to share with us? And also, what did he think of his 2 flights on Gemini as well? Because his Apollo overshadows everything that he did before. Of course, Apollo 8, Moonrise, all of that, 13. But his 2 flights on Gemini as well. See, I'm using them interchangeably now. Gemini
and Gemini. I do that too. I do that as well.
I was just wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about Jim and your memories.
Jim was, as I wrote in Apollo 8, one of the things that made Jim a very good candidate for Gemini 7 for 2 weeks in space was his affability, his easygoingness, his lack of prickliness. What the assessment that went around NASA was, if you can't get along with Jim Lovell, you can't get along with anybody. And that was his reputation. That was what I found when I was working with him in the course of a year and a half of researching and writing Apollo 13. I can recall one time when we were working on the epilogue when there was a little bit of prickliness with some material he wanted included and our editor didn't really want it included. And, I think he felt a little bit like, something he had made a real effort on wasn't being fully appreciated. And that was one fleeting part of one fleeting phone call in which I thought, oh, this man is capable of getting peeved. It was just, I had never seen it in him. And, the rest of the time, it was the greatest collaboration I could have imagined. His thoughts on Gemini, I just think he had a grand time. I mean, I don't pretend that Gemini 7 was not a real hardship for him. He, described it as 2 weeks in a men's room. And, I think that's what it was like. But after Gemini 7, Frank Borman had enough of Gemini at that point. He immediately went on to Apollo. He was taken out of the Gemini flight rotation. Jim stayed around and flew as soon as he could and flew again on Gemini 12. And that was, it was a perfect mission. It was a capstone mission. They accomplished every little thing they needed and wanted to accomplish. And, I think Jim was very proud of that mission. The greatest lesson I got from Jim came toward the end of our Apollo 13 project. The book was out. The movie was out. It was everywhere. I mean, politicians were quoting failure is not an option. Houston, we've got a problem, became an immediate part of the popular lexicon. The book was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. The movie was the most seen movie in the world at that point. And Jim, who had experienced incandescent fame during the Gemini and Apollo programs, and then experienced less fame when, the lights went off. He said to me when we were talking about how wonderfully the movie was doing and the book was doing, he said, just remember where you're standing on the stage when the spotlight goes off, because no one's going to help you to the wings. And I thought, my God, what a wonderful piece of wisdom. He was born in the same year as my dad. I'm probably sharing too much information here, but I didn't really know my father all that well. And, I didn't really grow up with him. And I thought it was a sweet bit of kismet that, a man I got to work with was the same age, born the same year as my father. And he felt a little bit paternal to me, Jim did. I don't know if he saw me the same way, saw me as a surrogate son. He has 2 sons of his own. He certainly didn't need a non-blood son. But I felt that kind of primal connection to him. And, I am so glad the world got 97 years of Jim Lovell. We are, 97 years richer for it.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. Do you want to just remind us about the title of the book? And then we can wrap things up.
Great. It is Gemini or Gemini, Stepping Stone to the Moon, The Untold Story, and it's available wherever fine books are sold.
Links will be in the description for all those good things. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much for sending over the copy of it. I read it really, really quickly and then had to go back because I'd forgot to highlight the bits I wanted to talk to you about. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I cannot thank Jeffrey Kluger enough for joining us here on the Aviation Show to discuss Gemini, Stepping Stone to the Moon, The Untold Story, which is available now in the US through all the usual places, including through bookshop.org, which you can check out our affiliate link in the description below. In the UK, you have to go through Amazon. There's a link for that as well. But hopefully we'll have a formal UK release soon. Do stick around because our Gemini discussion continues as we sit down with Andy Saunders, the author of the fantastic Gemini and Mercury Remastered, and we delve into all the technicalities that go in to bringing the incredible imagery that we've seen through this episode, how he's brought it back to vivid life to the point where the astronauts were blown away as they were seeing space just as they saw it all those years ago. So be sure to check out our episode with Andy. Join us on Patreon if you want all these episodes early and ad-free. Starts from just £3 a month. Check out the links in the description below. Please like and subscribe as it helps our AI overlords to share these videos far and wide. So, until next time, thank you for joining us on the Aviation Show. Do check out the Pima Air and Space Museum. The space bit means there's space bits. Go check them out. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Until next time, bye-bye. I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month, plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad production.